You think you know how power looks until you see it go dead silent. The room was full of killers, racketeers, men who broke legs for a missed payment. But when Dante looked up from the ledger, his eyes locking onto the dark, swelling bruise on his secretary's jaw, every single one of those monsters stopped breathing. He didn't yell. He didn't stand up. He just asked 3 words that sealed a man's fate. "He hurt you?" Audrey Ellis applied the 3rd layer of concealer with the steady, detached precision of a mortician. The bathroom light was harsh, fluorescent, unforgiving. It caught the yellow-purple edges of the contusion blooming along her left jawline and dipping beneath the collar of her silk blouse. Ben had thrown a heavy ceramic mug. It wasn't meant for her face, or so he claimed, weeping and apologizing on the kitchen floor 10 minutes later. But it had shattered against the wall, and the heavy curved handle had caught her on the rebound. Her cheekbone throbbed in time with her pulse. She dabbed the sponge again. Blend the edges. Dust it with setting powder. Do not cry, because tears streak the makeup, and she didn't have time to redo it. Dante Gallo liked his coffee black, exactly at 7:30, resting on the left corner of his mahogany desk. It was 7:12. Audrey buttoned her collar to the very top. It felt like a chokehold, but it covered the worst of the bruising on her neck. She checked her reflection. She looked stiff, pale, but presentable. No one would look too closely. Men like the ones she worked for rarely looked at the help unless they wanted something, and Audrey had spent 3 years making sure she was practically invisible. Competent, but invisible. The Gallo family front was an import-export logistics firm in the financial district. The reality was a sprawling syndicate that controlled the docks, the unions, and half the illicit shipping lanes on the eastern seaboard. Audrey knew this. She handled the legitimate paperwork, scheduled the contractor meetings, and knew how to scrub blood out of the carpet in the executive lounge. She was 32, entirely alone in the city, and terrified of her own shadow when she was at home. But at the office, she was untouchable. The irony wasn't lost on her. She felt safer surrounded by organized criminals than she did in her own apartment with a mid-level insurance adjuster. She walked out of the restroom, her heels clicking a rhythmic, even tempo against the polished marble floor. The boardroom was already occupied. She could smell them before she saw them. Stale espresso, expensive Italian wool, and the sharp coppery tang of cheap cigars that Paulie insisted on smoking despite the building's regulations. Audrey pushed open the heavy oak doors. 12 men sat around the long table. These were Dante's capos, thick-necked men with broken noses and expensive watches. Men who spoke in low, gravelly murmurs and settled disputes with extreme prejudice. At the head of the table sat Dante Gallo. Dante wasn't a caricature. He didn't wear tracksuits or flashy pinky rings. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit, his dark hair neatly parted, his jaw sharp and dusted with a shadow of stubble. He looked like a Wall Street predator, save for the stillness in his eyes. It was a flat, cold stillness. Dante never raised his voice. He didn't have to. When Dante spoke softly, people bled. "The margin on the Rotterdam shipment is unacceptable, Paulie," Dante was saying as Audrey approached with his coffee. His voice was a low baritone, calm, almost bored. "I told you to cut the middleman out of the Port Authority. You paid him anyway." "He was making noise, Mr. Gallo," Paulie muttered, looking down at his hands. A man who weighed 250 pounds, shrinking under the gaze of a man 40 pounds lighter. "I figured 20 grand buys his silence for the quarter. 20 grand buys his expectation for next quarter," Dante corrected. Audrey stepped up to Dante's left. She kept her head angled slightly away, a subconscious defense mechanism she'd developed overnight to hide the left side of her face. She set the saucer down on the exact corner of the desk. The ceramic clinked softly. "Thank you, Audrey," Dante said. He didn't look up from the ledger. "The weekly projections are in your secondary folder, sir," she said. Her voice was steady, professional. But speaking pulled the bruised muscle in her jaw, and a sharp, electric spike of pain shot up to her temple. She swallowed hard, suppressing a flinch, and turned to distribute the rest of the files to the men at the table. She walked the perimeter of the room, drop a file, nod, move on. She was a ghost, but ghosts don't ache. Every step sent a dull reverberation up her spine. Ben had pushed her into the counter before the mug incident. Her lower ribs felt bruised, making it difficult to draw a full breath. She kept her posture rigid, ignoring the sweat prickling at her hairline. Just get through the morning meeting, go back to her desk, take 3 ibuprofen, survive the day. "I want the docs locked down by Friday," Dante continued, picking up his pen. "If he wants to make noise, let him talk to the water." Audrey reached the end of the table. She just needed to hand Paulie his revised manifest. She leaned forward. The movement was a mistake. The stiff collar of her blouse rubbed harshly against the swollen skin of her neck. The sudden friction was unbearable. Without thinking, Audrey gasped, a small, sharp sound, and her hand flew to her collar, pulling it down slightly to relieve the pressure. In the bright, unsparing light of the boardroom chandelier, the thick, heavy makeup smeared against the white silk, and the bruise, angry, violet, and mottled with dark red, was exposed to the room. It was a small noise, a tiny fractured intake of air. In a bustling cafe, it would have gone unnoticed. But Dante Gallo's boardroom wasn't a cafe. It was an ecosystem built on acute paranoid observation. Dante stopped writing. The scratch of his fountain pen on the heavy parchment paper ceased abruptly. He didn't snap his head up. He didn't gasp. He simply raised his eyes from the ledger and looked across the length of the long, mahogany table. He looked at Audrey. Audrey froze. Her hand was still clutching the fabric of her collar, frozen in the act of pulling it away from her skin. She felt the sudden, crushing weight of his gaze. It was physical. It felt like being pinned to a board by a lepidopterist. She quickly let go of the collar, her fingers trembling, trying to smooth the silk back over the dark mark. She turned her head, angling her face toward the floor. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. She reached for the empty tray on the side table, desperate to retreat. "I'll just—" "Audrey." Dante's voice wasn't loud. It didn't boom or echo, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. Paulie, who had been mid-breath preparing an excuse for the Rotterdam shipment, snapped his mouth shut. The rustling of papers around the table died instantly. 12 dangerous, violent men went entirely still. They recognized that tone. It was the tone Dante used right before something catastrophic happened. Audrey stopped walking. Her back was to him. She closed her eyes, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. "Please," she thought. "Please just let it go. Don't look at me." "Turn around," Dante said. The command was absolute. It offered no room for negotiation. Slowly, feeling like she was moving through wet cement, Audrey turned. She kept her chin tucked, her eyes fixed on the knot of Paulie's cheap tie. She couldn't meet Dante's eyes. If she met his eyes, The thin, fragile dam holding her composure together would shatter. Dante stared at her. He didn't say a word for what felt like an eternity. He was processing the visual data, the smeared makeup on the collar, the stiffness in her shoulders, the angle of her head, the unnatural, panicked shallowness of her breathing. He stood up. The scrape of his heavy leather chair pushing back against the hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Several of the capos flinched. Nobody spoke. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, suffocating. Dante walked slowly down the length of the table. He didn't look at Paulie. He didn't look at the ledgers. His dark eyes were locked entirely on Audrey. She stood rooted to the spot, clutching the plastic serving tray against her stomach like a shield. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, close enough that she could smell the clean, sharp scent of cedar and expensive soap on him. "Look at me," he ordered softly. Audrey shook her head, a tiny, jerky motion. "Mr. Gallo, please, I have to format the quarterly." "Audrey." He didn't reach out. He didn't touch her. He knew better than to crowd a cornered animal. "Look at me." She forced her eyes up. They met his. Dante's eyes were usually an unreadable, flat, dark brown. Right now, they were pitch black. He leaned in, just an inch. His eyes tracked down her face, pausing on the thick layer of concealer, tracing the line of the bruise where it disappeared beneath the white silk of her collar. He saw the smear of makeup on the fabric. He saw the slight swelling of her cheekbone. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, muffled by the thick, bullet-resistant glass of the windows. Inside, 12 men held their breath, waiting for the floor to drop out from under them. Dante's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath his skin. It was the only physical display of emotion he allowed himself. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. It was a terrifying, hollow sound. "He hurt you?" The words dropped into the room like anvils. Audrey's breath hitched. She wanted to lie. She had a lie prepared. "I was clumsy. I ran into a door frame. I tripped over the rug in the dark." It was the standard script. She had rehearsed it in the mirror while applying the makeup. But looking into Dante's eyes, the lie withered in her throat. You didn't lie to Dante Gallo. It wasn't just a rule. It was a basic survival instinct. He saw right through the polite fiction of her survival mechanism. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lower lip trembled. A single, traitorous tear spilled over her lower lash line, cutting a clean track through the heavy powder on her cheek. Her silence was the only answer he needed. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The capos, men who had seen, ordered, and committed atrocities, suddenly found the mahogany grain of the table fascinating. They shifted uncomfortably. They knew the dynamic. Audrey wasn't just staff. She was the gatekeeper. She was the one who remembered their birthdays, who smoothed over Dante's moods, who kept the chaotic machinery of their lives running flawlessly. She was untouchable. Someone had touched her. Dante didn't break eye contact with her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even turn his head. "Get out," Dante said to the room. Nobody asked for clarification. Nobody gathered their folders. Chairs scraped frantically against the floor. Big, heavy men moved with the panicked haste of fleeing roaches. Within 10 seconds, the heavy oak doors opened and closed. They were alone. Audrey stood in the echoing silence of the empty boardroom, the tray still clutched to her chest. She felt exposed, stripped raw. The tears she had fought so hard to suppress in the bathroom were now falling freely, hot and humiliating. "I'm sorry," she choked out, staring at the floor again. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Gallo. It's unprofessional. I shouldn't have brought this into the office. I'll go pack my desk." She turned to leave, a deep, gnawing panic setting in. If she lost this job, she had nothing. Ben controlled the joint account. Ben controlled the lease. She was trapped. "Stop!" The word froze her. Dante walked over to the side table. He didn't look at her in her moment of humiliation. He poured a glass of water from the crystal pitcher. He walked back and held it out to her. "Put the tray down, Audrey. Drink this." She hesitated, then placed the tray on the table and took the glass with trembling hands. The rim rattled against her teeth as she took a sip. "You aren't packing anything," Dante said, quietly, leaning back against the edge of the mahogany table, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked relaxed, casual, but there was a coiled tension in his shoulders that screamed violence. "You aren't leaving this building, and you are never apologizing to me for someone else's sins again." Audrey gripped the glass. "You don't understand. It's complicated. He has a temper. It's my fault. I should have..." "Stop talking." Dante's voice was gentle, but firm. "Do not do that. Do not recite the script he beat into your head. It insults your intelligence, and it insults mine." Audrey closed her mouth, swallowing hard. "Who?" Dante asked. "One word. A simple request for data." "It doesn't matter," Audrey whispered. "I'm handling it." "You're hiding it," Dante corrected softly. "There is a difference. I asked you a question, Audrey. Give me the name. You can't get involved in this. This is my personal life." Dante let out a slow, quiet breath. "Audrey, you have sat outside my door for 3 years. You know exactly what I do for a living. You know exactly what I am capable of. Do you truly believe there is a line between your personal life and my territory when someone puts their hands on what is mine?" The phrasing sent a shockwave through her. What is mine? He didn't mean it romantically. He meant it territorially. She belonged to his organization. She was under his roof. In Dante's world, you did not touch something that belonged to the boss. It was a matter of respect. It was a matter of principle. "Ben," she whispered, the name tasting like ash. "Ben Carter." Dante didn't write it down. He didn't ask for a last name or an address. He already knew. He paid her salary. He had run a background check on her the day she was hired. He knew the insurance firm Ben worked for. He probably knew Ben's social security number. Dante reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a single number and put the phone to his ear. "Don't hurt him!" Audrey blurted out, panic flaring. She was terrified of Ben, but the reality of what Dante could do was monstrous. "Please, Mr. Gallo, I just want him to leave me alone. I don't want anyone to die." Dante held up a single finger, asking for silence. "Tommy," Dante said into the phone. His voice was conversational, light even. "I need a crew at 54 West Elm, apartment 4B, a man named Ben Carter." Audrey squeezed her eyes shut. "No, nothing messy," Dante said, watching Audrey's face. "The opposite. I want him entirely erased from the infrastructure. Empty the apartment. Everything he owns goes to the landfill. Break the lease. Withdraw the funds from the joint accounts and transfer them to Audrey's private offshore. Call his employer. Tell them he's relocating to London permanently and won't be finishing out his 2 weeks." Audrey stared at him, her mouth slightly open. He wasn't ordering a hit. He was ordering an unpersoning. "If he's at work right now, intercept him before he gets home," Dante continued, checking his heavy silver watch. "Take him for a drive. Explain to him that if he ever contacts Audrey Ellis again, If he ever steps foot in this city again, if he so much as searches her name on the internet, I won't just kill him. I'll peel him like a grape and make him watch." There was a pause as the man on the other end spoke. "Yes," Dante said softly. "Tonight. And Tommy, take Paulie with you. Let him work off his frustration about the Rotterdam shipment." Dante hung up the phone and slid it back into his pocket. He looked at Audrey. She was trembling, but the terror was gone, replaced by a bizarre, floating sense of unreality. In less than 60 seconds, Dante Gallo had dismantled her abuser's entire existence. He had severed the chains she had spent 3 years believing were unbreakable. "Sit down, Audrey," Dante said, gesturing to one of the heavy leather chairs. She walked over on numb legs and sank into the leather. "You are going to take the rest of the week off," Dante said, moving back to the head of the table. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with the same calm authority he used to run his empire. "I have a penthouse at the St. Regis that is currently vacant. You will stay there. My private physician will be up in an hour to look at those ribs." "How did you know about my ribs?" she whispered. "You breathe like a woman trying not to expand her lungs, and you haven't turned your torso all morning." He picked up his fountain pen again, pulling the ledger back toward him. "Your salary is doubled, effective immediately. Consider it hazard pay for the lack of observation on my part. I should have noticed the shift in your demeanor 2 weeks ago." Audrey sat in the quiet room, listening to the soft scratch of his pen. The monster at the head of the table wasn't looking at her anymore. He had dealt with the threat, neutralized the problem, and gone back to his ledgers. She leaned back in the chair, and for the first time in 3 years, she drew a full, deep breath. It hurt her ribs, but it felt entirely like freedom. The silence of the penthouse was heavier than the silence in Dante's boardroom. Audrey sat on the edge of a king-sized mattress, her feet sinking into a rug that cost more than her college education. The St. Regis was impeccably quiet. The walls were thick enough to block out the chaotic symphony of the city below. The only sound was the low, mechanical hum of the central air conditioning and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. Dr. Anthony Evans had come and gone. He was an older man with a neat gray beard and a medical bag that looked like it had survived a war zone. He didn't ask how she got the bruise on her jaw. He didn't ask why 2 of her ribs were fractured. He moved with the practiced, detached efficiency of a man who routinely dug bullets out of kneecaps without filing police reports. He wrapped her ribs tightly, gave her a bottle of prescription-strength painkillers without a pharmacy label, and left a small jar of arnica salve on the marble bathroom counter. "Mr. Gallo prefers his staff in prime working condition," was all Dr. Evans said before letting himself out. Now Audrey was alone. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread out beneath her, a glittering grid of amber streetlights and crawling traffic. She felt entirely unmoored. Earlier that afternoon, she had opened her banking app on her phone. She had expected to see the miserable $300 she usually managed to hide from Ben. Instead, her checking account balance read $42,500. There was a wire transfer notification from an LLC she didn't recognize. She had tried calling her landlord to ask about her belongings. The number went to a disconnected tone. She checked her social media. Ben's profiles were gone, not deactivated, scrubbed. It was as if Benjamin Carter had never existed. Dante hadn't just broken her chains, he had vaporized them. But staring out at the skyline, the sheer, terrifying scope of his power settled over her skin like a cold sweat. She wasn't free. She had simply traded a sloppy, emotional tyrant for a cold, omnipotent one. Ben controlled her through fear and finances. Dante controlled reality itself. There was a heavy knock on the heavy oak door of the suite. Audrey flinched, her hand instinctively coming up to protect her ribs. She waited a beat, then walked slowly to the door and checked the peephole. A man in a dark suit was standing in the hallway. It was Carmine, one of Dante's younger enforcers. He held a garment bag in one hand and a stack of white boxes in the other. She opened the door a few inches, leaving the security chain engaged. "Evening, Miss Ellis," Carmine said. He didn't look at her face. His eyes remained fixed respectfully on the brass door knocker at his eye level. It was a stark departure from how the men usually treated her. Before today, they leered. They made crude jokes by the water cooler. Now, Carmine looked at her like she was a loaded bomb. "What is this, Carmine?" "Mr. Gallo sent over some necessities," Carmine replied gruffly. "Since your previous residence has been liquidated. He said to tell you the personal shopper guessed your sizes, but if anything needs tailoring, a seamstress is on call." Audrey unhooked the chain and pulled the door open. Carmine stepped inside just far enough to place the boxes on the entryway console and hang the garment bag on the closet hook. He backed out immediately. "I'll be down the hall if you need anything," Carmine added. "Room 412. Don't open the door for room service. I'll bring it to you." He shut the door before she could reply. Audrey stood in the foyer, staring at the boxes. She opened the top one. It was a pair of black leather pumps, Christian Louboutin. The next box held a silk blouse, tag still attached. It was a conservative cut, high-necked. Exactly her style, but the fabric was infinitely softer than anything she had ever owned. The garment bag contained 3 bespoke skirts and 2 tailored blazers. It was a complete wardrobe, professional, understated, and terrifyingly expensive. She walked into the bathroom and stared at herself in the harsh vanity lights. The arnica salve had begun to work, turning the angry purple of her bruise into a sickly, mottled yellow. She looked exhausted. She looked hollow. She stripped off the clothes she had worn to the office, clothes that felt like a lifetime ago, and stepped into the shower. She let the scalding water beat down on her back, careful not to soak the bandages around her ribs. She didn't cry. She was too numb for tears. When she got out, she dried off and put on one of the oversized plush robes the hotel provided. She walked back into the living room, picked up her phone, and stared at Dante's contact name. She had his private number. She used it to remind him of offshore wire transfers or meetings with unsavory politicians. She drafted a text. "Thank you for the clothes. You didn't have to do that." She stared at the words. They felt weak. They felt subservient. She deleted them. Instead, she set the alarm on her phone for 6:30 a.m. She wasn't going to sit in this golden cage for a week. She was going back to work. She needed the routine. She needed the grounding reality of spreadsheets and ledgers. If she stayed in this silent, expensive room any longer, she was going to lose her mind. The atmosphere in the Gallo Import-Export office on a Thursday morning was usually a low hum of aggressive, chaotic energy. Phones rang, men shouted across cubicles, and the air smelled heavily of burnt coffee and cheap cologne. When Audrey walked out of the elevator at exactly 7:15, the noise died. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic silence like in the boardroom. It was a slow, rolling wave of quiet that rippled across the open-plan floor as heads turned and eyes widened. Men stopped mid-sentence. Phones were hastily picked up or slammed down. Audrey kept her eyes forward, her posture rigid. She wore the new black Louboutins, a charcoal pencil skirt, and a high-necked cream blouse from the boxes Carmine had delivered. The high collar covered the bruising on her neck, but she hadn't bothered with the heavy concealer on her face this time. The yellowish-green contusion on her jaw was visible for anyone bold enough to look. Nobody looked. She walked past Paulie, who was usually loud and abrasive. He practically flattened himself against a filing cabinet to let her pass, his eyes fixed firmly on his own shoes. She was radioactive. Dante Gallo had burned down a man's life to the foundation simply for putting a hand on her. She wasn't just the secretary anymore. She was a living, breathing warning label. Audrey set her purse down at her desk. It felt alien to be back in her own chair, booting up her dual monitors as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis 36 hours ago. She went to the break room. She made the coffee. Exactly 7:30. Black. No sugar. She carried the ceramic cup down the long, carpeted hallway toward the executive suite. The heavy oak doors were closed. She knocked twice, a sharp, professional rhythm, and opened the door without waiting for an answer. Dante was sitting at his desk, staring out the window at the harbor. He didn't turn around when she entered. He was speaking softly into a headset. "Tell the union boss that if the containers aren't unloaded by midnight, I'm taking the difference out of his pension fund," Dante said. He tapped a key on his laptop, terminating the call, and finally turned his chair around. He saw Audrey standing there, the coffee cup resting perfectly on the left corner of his desk. He didn't look surprised. He looked analytically at her face, registering the lack of makeup, the fading bruise, the rigid set of her shoulders. "I told you to take the week off," Dante said. His voice was calm, a low rumble that vibrated against the mahogany walls. "I prefer to work, Mr. Gallo," Audrey replied. Her voice was steady, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her taped ribs. Dante leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. "The St. Regis wasn't to your liking. The accommodations are fine, but sitting in a hotel room doing nothing makes me feel like a liability. Or a kept woman. I am neither." A flicker of something crossed Dante's dark eyes. It was too fast to read. Maybe amusement, maybe irritation. "You are recovering from physical trauma. I have bruised ribs, not a traumatic brain injury. I can type. I can manage the phones." Audrey stepped back, folding her hands in front of her. "I want to be clear about something, sir. By all means, Audrey, enlighten me." "I am grateful for what you did," she said, forcing the words past the tight lump in her throat. "More than I can articulate. You saved my life. But I am your employee. I manage your logistics. I balance the secondary ledgers. And I keep the capos from killing each other over scheduling conflicts. I earn my salary. I will not accept charity, and I will not be a pet project." The silence stretched. Dante stared at her. It was the same flat, unreadable stare he had used in the boardroom, the one that made grown men sweat. Audrey forced herself to hold his gaze. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands to keep them from trembling. If she backed down now, she would never have solid ground to stand on again. "You checked your bank account," Dante stated. It wasn't a question. "I did, and I will be wiring the surplus funds back to whichever shell corporation you pulled them from. My standard salary is sufficient." Dante let out a slow breath. He reached forward, picked up the coffee cup, and took a sip. "The funds in that account are the liquidated assets of Benjamin Carter. His savings, his 401k, the sale of his vehicle. I simply redirected the capital. Consider it an aggressive severance package. It belongs to you." Audrey blinked, momentarily derailed. You robbed him? I reallocated resources, Dante corrected smoothly. He owed a debt for damaging company property. He paid it. The ledger is balanced. The cold corporate terminology he applied to violence was jarring. Company property. I'm not property, Audrey said quietly. Dante set the cup down. The ceramic clinked sharply against the saucer. He stood up. He moved with a terrifying grace for a man in a tailored suit, rounding the desk until he was standing a few feet in front of her. No, Dante agreed, his voice dropping in volume. You are not. Property is replaceable. You are an asset, a vital, highly competent asset who knows the names of my offshore accounts and the schedules of my shipments. You are inside the walls, Audrey. You have been inside the walls for 3 years. I protect what is inside my walls. He reached out. Audrey tensed, her breath catching, but she didn't step back. Dante's hand stopped an inch from her face. He didn't touch her skin. He merely traced the air over the contour of her bruised jawline. The heat radiating from his palm made the fine hairs on her neck stand up. Your pride is intact. That is good, Dante said softly. You will need it. But do not confuse my protection for charity. I require you functional. If working makes you functional, then work. But if you flinch every time a door slams, I will send you back to that hotel room until your nerves are settled. Are we clear? Yes, Mr. Gallo. Dante dropped his hand and stepped back, breaking the heavy, suffocating proximity. Good. The Rotterdam shipment is a disaster. Paulie botched the payoff. The Port Authority middleman is coming here at noon to renegotiate. I need the revised manifests printed, and I need Carmine and Tommy stationed inside the office, not in the lobby. Audrey nodded automatically, her professional instincts kicking in. Do you want the meeting in the boardroom or your office? My office, Dante said, sitting back down and pulling his laptop open. And Audrey, cancel my afternoon appointments. This might take a while. By 11:45 a.m., the office had cleared out. It wasn't a formal evacuation order, but the staff possessed an uncanny, survival-based intuition. When Carmine and Tommy, 2 men built like brick outhouses who rarely smiled, took up positions inside the glass doors of the executive suite, the lower-level accountants and analysts found excuses to take early, extended lunches. Audrey sat at her desk, typing rapidly. She was compiling the financial damage of the Rotterdam delay. It was bad. Millions of dollars of electronics and automotive parts were sitting in steel shipping containers on the docks, held hostage by a corrupt port official who had realized Dante Gallo was vulnerable to a supply chain bottleneck. At precisely noon, the elevator chimed. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting brown suit that screamed government salary, but the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist told a different story. He had a red, bulbous nose and small, greedy eyes. This was O'Malley. He strutted past Audrey's desk without acknowledging her existence, flanked by 2 large, imposing men of his own. Union muscle. Dock workers who doubled as enforcers. Carmine stepped forward, blocking the heavy oak doors to Dante's office. He patted down O'Malley and his men with a rough, invasive efficiency, ignoring their indignant grunts. Once satisfied they weren't carrying, Carmine pushed the doors open. Mr. O'Malley, Dante's voice drifted out, pleasant and cold. Punctual. Come in. The doors shut. Audrey stared at her monitors, but she wasn't seeing the spreadsheets. She was listening. The walls of Dante's office were soundproofed, but she knew the rhythm of these meetings. 10 minutes of posturing, 5 minutes of escalating demands. Then the hammer fell. 15 minutes passed. The heavy oak door swung open. "Audrey," Dante called out, "bring the revised ledger, please." She grabbed the leather-bound folder from her desk, took a steadying breath, and walked into the office. The atmosphere was thick, charged with violent potential. O'Malley was sitting in one of the guest chairs, sweating profusely. His 2 union thugs stood behind him, trying to look intimidating, but Tommy and Carmine were positioned at the flanks of the room, looking bored and lethal. Dante sat behind his desk. He looked perfectly relaxed. Audrey walked over to Dante's left, keeping her eyes fixed on the desk. She placed the open folder in front of him. "Thank you," Dante murmured. He looked down at the numbers. "Mr. O'Malley, according to my secretary's meticulous calculations, your little embargo on the docks has cost my firm $640,000 in late delivery penalties over the last 48 hours. That's the cost of doing business, Gallo," O'Malley sneered, though his voice lacked conviction. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his forehead. "The fee went up, 50 grand a week, or the containers stay sealed until customs decides to rip them apart for a detailed inspection." Audrey stood frozen by Dante's elbow. She wanted to leave. Protocol dictated she leave once the documents were delivered, but Dante hadn't dismissed her. 50 grand a week, Dante repeated. He closed the leather folder. The sharp snap of the closure made O'Malley flinch. "You are a greedy man, O'Malley. Greed is predictable. I can work with greed. What I cannot work with is disrespect. You took a bribe from Paulie, and then you halted the shipment anyway. You broke a contract." "It wasn't a formal contract," O'Malley shot back, his face reddening. "Every word I speak is a contract," Dante said softly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't signal his men. The shift in the room was entirely energetic. The air pressure seemed to drop. Dante stood up slowly. He walked around the edge of his mahogany desk. O'Malley's thugs tensed, but Tommy casually unbuttoned his suit jacket, resting his hand on the butt of the holster at his hip. The thugs froze. Dante stopped in front of O'Malley. "You have a wife, Diane, 2 daughters in college out of state. You have a pension waiting for you in 3 years. You have built a comfortable life skimming off the top of the Port Authority." O'Malley's bluster vanished, replaced by stark, sudden terror. "Are you threatening my family, Gallo? Because the feds—" "I don't threaten families," Dante interrupted smoothly. "Families are innocent. I threaten you. I am telling you the beautiful things you have built, and I am telling you that you will not live to see the sunset today to enjoy them if those containers are not released by 1 o'clock. "You wouldn't dare," O'Malley whispered. "You kill me in your own office. The heat." Dante moved so fast, Audrey didn't even see the wind-up. It wasn't a punch. It was a vicious, open-handed strike. Dante's palm connected with the side of O'Malley's head with a sickening, wet crack. The sheer force of the blow tipped O'Malley's heavy leather chair completely backward. The port official hit the hardwood floor with a massive thud, crying out as his head bounced against the varnished wood. The 2 Union thugs lunged forward instinctively, but Tommy and Carmine were already there. Carmine grabbed one thug by the throat, driving him backward into the bookcase with bone-jarring force. Tommy simply drew his weapon, pressing the cold steel barrel directly into the forehead of the second thug. "Don't," Tommy whispered. The thug raised his hands in surrender, trembling violently. Audrey stumbled back, pressing her spine against the edge of Dante's desk. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. She had known they were violent men. She had scheduled their meetings. She had balanced their bloody ledgers, but she had never seen it happen. The sudden, explosive reality of the violence was paralyzing. Dante stood over O'Malley. The older man was groaning on the floor, blood pooling rapidly from a deep split over his ear, where Dante's heavy silver watch had caught the skin. Dante reached into his pocket, pulled out a stark white linen handkerchief, and meticulously wiped a speck of blood from his knuckles. 1 o'clock, O'Malley, Dante said, his voice entirely devoid of adrenaline or anger. It was terrifyingly calm. Or I will have Tommy take you down to the harbor and feed you to the dredging machines piece by piece. Call the docks. O'Malley, weeping and clutching his bleeding head, fumbled wildly in his pockets for his phone. With shaking, blood-slicked fingers, he dialed. Release! Release the Gallo containers! O'Malley sobbed into the receiver. All of them, now, bypass customs. Just let them go. He dropped the phone on the floor. Dante looked at Carmine. Escort Mr. O'Malley and his associates to the freight elevator. Make sure they leave the building. Carmine hauled the bleeding man off the floor by his collar. The Union thugs backed out of the room, hands raised, eyes wide with panic. Within seconds, the office was empty, save for Dante and Audrey. The silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. Dante tossed the ruined, bloody handkerchief into the brass wastebasket by his desk. He straightened his cuffs, the gold links catching the midday light. He finally turned to look at Audrey. She was still pressed against the desk, her chest heaving, staring at the smear of fresh blood on the hardwood floor. Dante walked slowly toward her. He stopped a few feet away, observing the pale shock on her face. He didn't offer a glass of water this time. He didn't offer an apology. He offered the unvarnished truth. You manage the paperwork, Audrey, Dante said quietly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. But this is the business. This is what buys the St. Regis penthouse. This is what erases a man like Benjamin Carter from existence. Audrey swallowed hard. The metallic tang of fear was thick in her mouth. She looked from the blood on the floor back to Dante's face. He wasn't a white knight. He wasn't a savior. He was an apex predator, and he had just shown her his teeth. But as she looked at him, feeling the taped ribs tight against her lungs, she realized something horrifying. She wasn't running for the door. The blood, Audrey whispered, her voice surprisingly steady, though it lacked volume. She pointed a trembling finger at the floor. It's going to stain the hardwood if we don't clean it immediately. Dante stared at her for a long, silent moment. The flat, cold stillness in his eyes fractured, replaced by a dark, intense gleam of pure, primal approval. I'll have maintenance bring up the bleach, Dante said softly. The maintenance crew never came. Audrey didn't call them. Instead, she walked to the supply closet adjacent to the break room, her heels clicking an aggressive, steady rhythm against the tiles. She found the industrial bleach, a pair of thick yellow rubber gloves, and a heavy sponge. She carried them back to the executive suite. Dante was still at his desk, speaking quietly in Italian on his cell phone, securing the release of the Rotterdam containers. He paused mid-sentence as Audrey walked back in. She dropped the supplies onto the floor, snapped the heavy rubber gloves over her wrists, and sank to her knees beside the pooling blood. Dante ended the call. He set the phone down. Audrey, I said I would have maintenance handle that. Maintenance is a third-party contractor, Audrey replied, not looking up. She poured a generous measure of raw bleach directly onto the hardwood. The sharp, toxic smell of chlorine instantly overpowered the coppery stench of O'Malley's blood. They talk, they gossip. You just assaulted a federal port official in your office. We don't need a janitor selling the story to a grand jury. She pressed the sponge into the chemical puddle and began to scrub. The physical exertion pulled painfully at her taped ribs, but she welcomed the ache. It was a grounding sensation. Ben had made her feel small, clumsy, fundamentally broken. He had convinced her that the violence was a byproduct of her own incompetence. Dante had just demonstrated what real violence looked like. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a loss of control. It was a tool deployed with surgical precision to maintain order. And right now, Audrey was maintaining the order. Dante stood up and walked around the desk. He stopped just at the edge of the expanding circle of bleach. He looked down at her. She was wearing a $1,000 silk blouse and scrubbing a man's blood out of the floorboards like it was spilt wine. "You are a terrifying creature, Audrey," Dante said softly. Audrey paused. She looked up at him, pushing a stray lock of hair out of her face with the back of her forearm. "I'm a secretary. You were a secretary an hour ago," Dante corrected. He crouched down, his bespoke trousers pulling taut over his thighs, bringing his face level with hers. He didn't care about the fumes. He didn't care about the mess. He stared at her with that same intense, predatory evaluation. Secretaries panic. Secretaries quit. They do not calculate the legal risk of third-party janitorial staff while their hands are covered in bleach. "I told you," Audrey said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I manage the logistics." Dante reached out. This time, he didn't stop an inch away. He gripped her chin. His fingers were warm, incredibly strong, but careful not to press the fading yellow bruise on her left side. He tilted her face up, forcing her to hold his gaze. "You aren't afraid of me," Dante stated. It was a realization, not a question. "Should I be?" "Yes." Dante's thumb brushed lightly over her cheekbone, wiping away a microscopic speck of collateral blood that had splashed upward. "Every man in this building is afraid of me. Paulie sweats when I look at him. O'Malley just traded $1 million ransom for his life because he looked in my eyes and saw his own funeral. You watched me split a man's head open, and your first instinct was asset protection." Audrey didn't pull away from his grip. The warmth of his hand was a stark contrast to the cold, clinical reality of the room. "I survived 3 years with a man who hit me because the toast was cold. He was weak. Weak men are unpredictable. You aren't weak, Mr. Gallo. You are entirely predictable." Dante's eyes darkened, the black pupils dilating slightly. The formal title grated in the charged air between them. "Dante," he corrected softly. He let go of her chin, stood up, and walked over to the antique globe in the corner of the office. He opened it, revealing a hidden decanter of dark amber liquid and 2 heavy crystal glasses. He poured 2 measures of scotch. "Neat." He walked back and offered one to her. Audrey peeled the rubber gloves off, tossing them onto the floor. She took the glass. Her hands were perfectly steady. Dante tapped his glass against hers. A sharp, clear chime rang out. "To the logistics," Dante said. Audrey held his gaze. She took a sip. The scotch burned a fiery trail down her throat, searing away the remaining adrenaline, leaving nothing but a cold, absolute clarity. She had stepped out of the cage, only to walk willingly into the wolf's den. And to her profound shock, it felt exactly like home. 2 weeks passed. The bruise on Audrey's jaw faded entirely, leaving behind unmarked pale skin. The fractured ribs calcified, turning the sharp pain into a dull, manageable ache. The dynamic in the office shifted. It wasn't something officially announced. It was felt, Audrey no longer sat outside the heavy oak doors. Dante had a second desk moved into his office. It was smaller, elegant, placed directly across from his. She no longer fetched coffee. She managed the secondary ledgers, the real ledgers, the ones that tracked the illicit flow of capital through the shell companies Dante used to clean his money. She was the only person besides Dante who knew the exact numerical value of the Gallo Syndicate. She was untouchable, and that made her a target. It happened on a Tuesday. It was pouring rain, the kind of torrential downpour that turned the New York streets into a gray, gridlocked nightmare. Dante was at the shipyards. A dispute over a manifest required his physical presence. He had taken Tommy and 3 other men. Audrey was in the office alone with Carmine. The rest of the floor was empty. The analysts sent home early due to a power fluctuation in the building's grid. Audrey was typing a sequence of offshore wire transfers when the secondary elevator chimed. Not the main lobby elevator, the freight elevator, the one that required a bypass key. Audrey stopped typing. She looked up. The thick, soundproofed glass of the executive suite looked out over the empty cubicle farm. The lights were dim, flickering slightly. Carmine, who was sitting on the leather sofa near the door reading a racing form, stood up instantly. He didn't say a word. He drew his weapon, a heavy, suppressed Glock, and moved toward the glass door. "Lock the system," Carmine ordered, his voice tight. Audrey didn't ask questions. She hit the kill switch on her keyboard. The dual monitors went black. The hard drives initiated a deep encryption lockdown. It would take a team of federal hackers 3 years to break the firewall. 3 men stepped out of the freight elevator. They weren't wearing suits. They wore dark tactical gear, water dripping from their jackets onto the carpet. They moved with a silent, synchronized efficiency. These weren't union thugs or street muscle. They were professionals, the Salerno family. Dante had warned her they were probing his territory, looking for weakness while his capital was tied up in the Rotterdam delay. They weren't here for Dante. They were here for the ledgers. And they knew Dante was at the docks. One of the men raised an assault rifle and fired. The sound was deafening, even through the suppressor. The thick glass of the executive suite spider-webbed, but it held. It was rated to stop a .50 caliber round. Carmine didn't flinch. He aimed through the shattered web of glass and returned fire. He hit the lead man in the thigh, dropping him to the carpet. But the other 2 immediately returned fire, a concentrated barrage that chewed through the heavy oak door frame and sent wood splinters flying like shrapnel. "Get in the vault!" Carmine yelled, ducking behind a heavy marble pillar. Behind Dante's desk was a false wall panel. Behind the panel was a steel-reinforced panic room that housed the physical hard drives and the emergency cash reserves. Audrey didn't move toward the vault. If she locked herself in the vault, Carmine was entirely alone. If Carmine died, they would simply wire the vault door with C4 and blow it open. Time was on their side. The police wouldn't respond to the financial district in this weather for at least 10 minutes, and the building's security had clearly been bought off. Another burst of gunfire shattered the mahogany trim near Audrey's head. She dropped below the desk. She heard a heavy thud, followed by a sharp, guttural groan. "Carmine?" Audrey yelled over the ringing in her ears. "Left shoulder?" Carmine grunted. He was pinned behind the sofa, bleeding heavily onto the leather. "They're moving up the flank. Get in the damn box, Audrey." Audrey crawled toward Dante's desk. She reached underneath, her fingers tracing the smooth wood until she found the biometric scanner hidden beneath the lip of the center drawer. She pressed her thumb to it. Dante had added her prints to the system 5 days ago. Click! A hidden compartment dropped open. Inside was Dante's secondary weapon, a Sig Sauer P226. Beside it were 2 spare magazines. Audrey grabbed the heavy, cold metal. She had never fired a gun in her life. But she understood mechanics, and she understood logic. The safety was a lever on the side. The slide was already racked. Point and pull. She crawled to the edge of the desk. The glass door had given way completely, shattering inward under the sustained assault. One of the men, tall, wearing a black balaclava, stepped through the ruined frame. He wasn't looking at the desk. He was focused on Carmine, who was struggling to reload his weapon with one good arm. The man raised his rifle, leveling it directly at Carmine's head. Audrey didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. She didn't announce herself. She did exactly what Dante would do. She eliminated the liability. She braced her wrists on the edge of the mahogany desk, aimed squarely at the center of the man's black tactical vest, and pulled the trigger. The recoil snapped her wrists back with vicious force, the deafening crack of the gunshot vibrating deep in her chest. The bullet struck the man dead center. He wore Kevlar, but the sheer kinetic impact of the 9mm round at 10 feet threw him violently backward. He hit the doorframe, dropping his rifle, gasping for air as his ribs fractured under the armor. The third man pivoted, swinging his weapon toward the desk. Audrey fired again, and again. She didn't aim precisely. She laid down a chaotic, deafening wall of suppressive fire that forced the man to dive behind a cubicle wall outside the office. The office plunged into a ringing, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the rain lashing against the exterior windows and Carmine's heavy, labored breathing. Audrey stood up slowly. Her hands were shaking violently now, but she kept the gun raised, the barrel pointed directly at the doorway. "Stay down!" Audrey shouted, her voice raw and jagged. "The primary drives are encrypted. The physical ledgers are rigged with thermite. If you cross that threshold, I trigger the burn protocol, and you leave here with nothing but ashes and a murder charge." It was a lie. There was no thermite. But the Salerno man didn't know that. He knew he was facing a woman who had just dropped his partner without blinking, and the timeline was collapsing. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a faint, rising howl cutting through the storm. Footsteps retreated, rapid, heavy boots pounding toward the freight elevator. The surviving man was dragging his injured partner away. Audrey didn't lower the gun. She kept it aimed at the empty doorway until the heavy mechanical grind of the elevator doors signaled their departure. Only then did she drop the magazine, clear the chamber exactly as she had seen the men do 100 times, and set the gun carefully on the desk. She walked over to Carmine. He was pale, pressing his good hand against the bullet hole in his shoulder. "You okay, Carmine?" she asked, her voice devoid of panic. Carmine looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound reverence. "You shot a made man, Miss Ellis." Audrey crouched down, pulling the pristine white silk scarf from her neck and pressing it hard against Carmine's wound to stem the bleeding. "He was interrupting my workflow," Audrey said. Dante arrived 12 minutes later. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs. The heavy oak doors to the office floor burst open, and Dante emerged, flanked by Tommy and 3 other men. His bespoke suit was soaked with rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. For the first time in 3 years, Audrey saw Dante Gallo look genuinely, visibly unhinged. He stepped into the ruined executive suite. The glass was shattered. The wood was splintered. The smell of cordite hung thick and acrid in the air. Carmine was sitting up, the bleeding controlled, a paramedic already cutting away his shirt. Audrey was sitting in Dante's chair behind the desk. She was staring at the computer monitors, typing with steady, deliberate keystrokes, bringing the encrypted drives back online. The Sig Sauer was resting neatly next to the mousepad. Dante signaled his men to hold position. He walked slowly across the room, stepping over the shattered glass. He stopped in front of the desk. He looked at the gun. He looked at the blood on Audrey's white blouse. Carmine's blood. He looked at her face. It was completely calm. The terrified, fragile woman who had stood in the boardroom 2 weeks ago trying to hide a bruise was dead. The woman sitting in his chair was someone entirely different. "Carmine tells me you held off a Salerno assault team with a handgun and a bluff," Dante said. His voice was low, rough around the edges. "I protected the assets," Audrey replied, not taking her eyes off the screen. "The offshore accounts are secure. The Rotterdam capital was untouched. You lost a glass door and a leather sofa. We're still in the black." Dante reached out and closed her laptop. The sudden click forced her to look up at him. He leaned down, placing both hands flat on the desk, bringing his face inches from hers. The mask of absolute control he always wore had fractured. Beneath it was something darker, hotter, and terrifyingly possessive. "I don't care about the capital, Audrey," Dante said softly. "I don't care about the Rotterdam shipment." "That's a lie," Audrey said smoothly. "You care deeply about the capital. It's why I work for you." Dante let out a low, rough breath. It was almost a laugh. He moved around the desk. He didn't ask for permission. He reached down, gripped her by the waist, and pulled her up out of the chair. Audrey gasped as her body collided against the solid wall of his chest. His clothes were damp from the rain, smelling of petrichor and gun oil. He backed her against the edge of the mahogany desk, his hands coming up to frame her face. "I left the shipyards the second Tommy got the alert that the building grid went down," Dante whispered, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. "Do you know what I thought about on the drive over here? It wasn't the ledgers. It wasn't the money. I thought about the fact that if a Salerno bullet touched you, I was going to burn this entire city to the bedrock." Audrey looked into his black, fathomless eyes. Ben had used anger to make her feel small. Dante used his anger to make her untouchable. "They didn't touch me," Audrey whispered, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his ruined suit. "I didn't let them." "No," Dante agreed, a fierce, dark pride burning in his gaze. "You didn't." He didn't hesitate anymore. Dante leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was aggressive, possessive, a collision of teeth and heat that tasted like scotch and adrenaline. It was a claim. Audrey kissed him back with equal ferocity, her fingers knotting in his damp hair, pulling him closer. The quiet, invisible secretary was gone. She was matching the monster, breath for breath, shadow for shadow. When Dante finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily. He kept his hands firmly on her hips, anchoring her to him. "You aren't my secretary anymore, Audrey," Dante said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. "Am I fired?" she asked, a faint, cynical smirk touching the corner of her mouth. "You're promoted," Dante corrected. He stepped back, straightening his jacket, the cold, composed Mafia boss sliding back into place, though the intense heat in his eyes remained strictly for her. "Tomorrow, you move your things into the master suite at the penthouse, and Tommy is taking you to the range. If you are going to carry my secondary piece, you need to learn how to aim for the head." Audrey looked at the ruined office, the men standing guard outside the door, and the ruthless, magnificent man standing in front of her. She reached down, picked up the Sig Sauer, and slid it smoothly into the top drawer of the desk. 9 a.m., Audrey said. Don't be late. Dante smiled. It was a rare, terrifying, and beautiful thing. Never, my love. Audrey walked into that office as a victim, but she walked out as a queen of the underworld. The transformation from a terrified secretary hiding a bruise to a fearless partner holding off a Mafia hit squad is the ultimate story of reclaiming power. If Dante and Audrey's dark, unapologetic romance had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves gritty Mafia drama and subscribe to the channel for more intense, high-stakes storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have pulled the trigger if you were Audrey?